Hi everyone. Today we're going to be looking at operations with fractions, but we're actually going to be looking at negative fractions. Okay, so instead of having all those lovely positive answers we have been having recently, we're going to have some negative fractions and mixed numbers thrown in there. Now, negative fractions and the way that they operate is very similar to how negative numbers operate. So, some key rules that you might need to remember is that if we have a positive and we multiply that with a negative, we're going to end up with a negative answer, okay? Whereas if I have a positive that has been multiplied with a positive, we are going to have a positive answer. And likewise, if I have a negative that has been multiplied with a negative, we're going to end up with a positive answer. So if the signs are different when we're multiplying or dividing, then we're going to have a negative answer. Okay, so same rules here for dividing. Now, the main thing that really tricks people up when it comes to negative numbers is when we're adding and subtracting. Okay, now, if I have a number, let's say 3, and I add a negative number like 7 on, that's the same as saying 3 subtract 7, okay, which would be negative 4. All right. Likewise, if I had 3 and I was to subtract positive 7, that's the same as 3 minus 7, okay? But if I was to have 3 and I was to subtract negative 7, that's actually the same as saying 3 plus 7, so 10, okay? So if our signs are different, you're going to end up subtracting that number, okay? But if I have a number and I've subtracted a negative from it, I'm actually adding that number to it. Okay, so the exact same rules here for fractions. If I have a negative fraction and I multiply that by a negative fraction, I'm going to end up with a positive fraction. Okay. Now, another key thing with negative fractions is how we write them. Okay, one of the easiest things to do is to actually get confused with how fractions written out. So if I have something like negative 3/4 and I went to do an operation with that, remember that a fraction is the numerator divided by the denominator. So that means that both of them can't be negative. One of them only has to be negative. Now, I find it easiest to just make the top number negative because at the end of the day, you're going to end up with the same answer. Okay? So if you have a negative fraction and then you go to do an operation with it, make the numerator the negative. It just makes it a lot easier, okay? Same with if I was to have, let's say, a mixed number like negative 2.5, that would be the same as saying negative 5 over 2, which is the same as saying negative 5 over 2, okay? So make the numerator your negative, okay, out of the 2. And then it just saves you from accidentally having a negative on both the numerator and the denominator. Okay, but let's have a look at some examples. Now, my first example here will be negative 5 over 3 times 7 over 2. Now, whenever you are working with a negative fraction, I would like you to make it really clear that the numerator is the negative, okay? So that means when we write it out, I'm going to write this out as negative 5 over 3. See how that's a lot clearer now? And then I've got that multiplied by 7 over 2. What that means is you won't overdo your negatives, but you won't lose them along the way. Doing this, I now have negative 5 times positive 7, and then positive 3 times positive 2. This is the same as negative 35 over 6, and you can write this out with the negative thrown out the front, all right? But once again, if you want to avoid that mistake, just leave the negative on the top, okay? Now, same rules are going to apply to dividing, but when you come to divide your fractions, I want you to keep flip change before you do anything else, okay? So that means I've got my first fraction staying the same. My second fraction, I'm going to leave that negative out the front, and I'm going to flip it and then change that division to a multiplication. Now, if you would like, you can do some cross cancelling, completely up to you. You will end up with the same answer either way. I am now, to make it very clear though, going to move that negative to the top of my fraction, to that numerator. And then I'm going to look at what I can cancel out here. And we can see that 5 and 25 both have a common factor of 5. okay? So this now becomes 2 times negative 5 over 1 times 11, which is going to be negative 10 over 11, okay? Which makes sense because we started with a positive and we divided that by a negative. So our final answer would be a negative. Now, adding and subtracting, very similar rules apply here. Okay, we still have to find our lowest common denominator and we still have to move that negative to the top just to avoid any mistakes. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is move that negative to the top and then we're going to find our lowest common denominator. Now in this case, our lowest common denominator is 6. So 3 times 2 would give us 6. That means that I have to multiply everything on this fraction by 2 and everything on this fraction by 3. That means that our negative is still going to stay up the top. Do not lose that negative, okay? This one here is going to become 33 over 6. And now I've got negative 10, and we're going to go forward 33, and we will end up at positive 23 over 6, okay? Now, feel free to pause the next one if you would like to give it a go by yourself. Otherwise, just stick around while I go through it. I'm going to do the same thing here. We're going to find our lowest common denominator, which for 11 and 2 is 22. That means I'm going to multiply everything on this first fraction by 2 and everything on the second fraction by 11. So I have 12 over 22, adding a negative 99 over 22. Now, remember that adding a negative is the same as subtracting, but we can also move that negative to the top of that fraction here. We know our denominator needs to stay the same, but this now becomes 12 plus negative 99, which is the same as saying 12 subtract 99. So our final answer would be negative 87 over 22, which can't be simplified any further. Now, mixed numbers also work in the same way. So if I was to want to multiply or divide mixed numbers, I would have to convert them to improper first and keep that negative sign. Converting this to improper, I have 2 times 7 plus 4 would be 18 over 7, keeping that negative sign with the fraction. And then same thing here, I've got 3 1/3, so I'm going to keep that negative sign. 3 times 3 plus 1 is 10, okay? Now, if you've got a keen eye, you would have noticed we absolutely can do some cross-cancelling. We have a factor here of 3, so I can divide both 18 and 3 by 3. So I now end up with negative 6 over 7 times negative 10 over 1. And I'm going to bring those negatives to the top. And what you're going to see is because we've got a negative multiplied by a negative, our answer should be positive. Negative 6 times negative 10 will give me 60, and 7 times 1 will give me 7. Okay? Now, lucky last problem for today, we obviously have to do some BODMAS with all this negative work we are doing. So feel free to pause the video here if you're feeling really confident. Otherwise, stick around. I will definitely go through it. Now, doing BODMAS, we know that we have to do brackets first, and then we have to do our order, division, multiplication, so on, so on. We can see we've got no brackets here, so I'm going to move on straight to multiplication because I can see that's our next step. Now, in this case, we're going to kind of add some imaginary brackets here to keep that negative with the 7 over 2. So currently our negative 3 1/4 is untouched. If we're multiplying here, once again, if you've got a keen eye, you might have seen that we can divide 14 and 7 both by 7, leaving 1 and 2, and that I can divide both 2 and 8 by 2. So that's already making that a lot easier. We have negative 1 over 1 times negative 4 over 2. If you simplify that on down, we know we've got negative 1 over 1 is just negative 1 times negative 4 over 2 is going to be negative 2, which leaves us with negative 3 1/4 plus positive 2 because we have a negative times a negative. If we add that 2 over to the negative 3, we are left with negative 1 1/4. Or if you've done it differently, you might have ended up with negative 5 over 4, which is still correct.